Hello, everyone, and welcome to the College and Career Readiness and Success Center's webinar, Pursuit of Equity, Leveraging Career and Technical Education for Students with Disabilities. This webinar is the first in a series of 4 webinars focused on supporting and promoting college and career readiness development opportunities for students with disabilities. My name is Ellen Cushing, and I'm the Deputy Director for the College and Career Readiness and Success Center, or the CCR Center. Before we get started, I wanted to share a little bit about the CCR Center. We are a federally funded technical assistance center charged with supporting state and local education agencies in their college and career readiness efforts, including supporting the development, implementation, and continuous improvement of policies and initiatives focused on a variety of topics, including employability skills, work-based learning, post-secondary preparedness, and the education to workforce pipeline. And we do this work by providing a range of technical assistance support to our stakeholders. Throughout the webinar, there will be several opportunities to engage with our moderator and presenters. The first is by using the chat box located on the right-hand screen, and this is the best way to engage with us. You can also use the raise hand function, which is located on the toolbar. And if you use that raise hand function, you can just click on it and then we will unmute your line so that you can talk with us directly. We will also have a post-event survey where you can share your feedback on your experience, ask any outstanding questions you might have, or share any additional insights from the webinar. Finally, I want to let you know that we will be recording this webinar, and we will share the recording on the CCR Center website under the Events tab. And now I'd like to turn the webinar over to today's moderator and my CCR Center colleague, Jamar Nellums.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you all for joining us. We're really glad that you're here today. And today's webinar will be 75 minutes in length to provide ample time for questions of our presenters. Today's agenda, we will start off with an audience poll so that we can get a gauge about the extent of students with disabilities and their involvement in your CTE program. And then we'll start off by hearing what research tells us about students with disabilities and CTE. And we'll be drawing from a comprehensive list of studies that provide an overview and synthesis in this area. And then we'll go to our career and technical education, inclusion, and post-secondary outcome for students with disabilities, which will highlight results and data from a longitudinal study regarding students with disabilities in Washington State. And then we're very fortunate to have perspectives from the field, where we will have representatives from Washington State talk with us about their programs and career pathway initiatives to assist students with disabilities in college and career readiness. And then we'll do another poll. And then finally, we will wrap up by hearing about ESSA and IDEA supporting students with disabilities, which will be an overview of content in a related brief and a focus on how both of these pieces of legislation can be leveraged to support post-secondary pathways for students with disabilities. And then we'll wrap it up. So we're going to start off with a poll question. And we'll give you about 30 seconds to a minute. And the question is, to what extent are students with disabilities involved in your CTE program? The first option being to a great extent, followed by somewhat, followed by very little, followed by not at all, followed by I don't know. And as you're completing the webinar, as you're completing the poll, I'm going to just briefly tell you a little bit about today's presenters, whose bios we've also provided, and they will be available after. We have Dr. Tessie Rose Bailey, who's a Principal Technical Assistance Consultant at the American Institutes for Research, where she provides technical assistance in special education and multi-tiered systems of support and response to intervention framework. We will also be joined today by Dr. Roddy Theobald, who is a senior researcher at the American Institutes for Research and primarily works with the National Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research, also referred to as CALDR. And then from Washington State, we have Tanya May, who is the Director of Special Education for the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. And there she carries out and implements the division's priorities focused on improving outcomes for students with disabilities. And then we also have Rebecca Wallace, who's the Executive Director of Career and Technical Education for the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, where she leads Washington's efforts to promote the quality and rigor of CTE and secondary education courses. And then helping us close out today's webinar will be Jenna Tomasella, who is a Policy Associate at the American Youth Policy Forum. And part of her work involves the development of learning events and the dissemination of policy and practice guidance to the AYPF network and other external networks. So we're really glad that everyone will be able to join us today. And what we can see is, to a great extent, we've got 17% of you have responded to great extent. And then it looks like the majority are in the somewhat category in terms of the involvement of students with disabilities in your CTE program. And some don't know, 23% would be the next largest number. So that's very helpful, and we hope that you find today's webinar useful in informing your work and then hopefully getting that response in the future up to a great extent. So I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Bailey and Dr. Theobald, who will talk to us about what research tells us about CTE and students with disabilities and inclusion, and then we'll field questions from our audience. So, Dr. Bailey.
All right, thank you, Jamara, and thank you, Ellen. I'm really excited to be here to share some of the research about the inclusion of students with disabilities in CTE programs. And we'll move on to the next slide. And before I get started, I just want to give you a little bit of context depending on where you come from. The majority of students with disabilities in our K-12 setting are served under what's referred to as IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And under that act, eligible students have access to an individualized education program. And the purpose of that program is to really outline the services that are being provided to the student. And as students become of age, which is 16 at the federal level and in some states 14, they're expected to have a transition plan as part of their individualized education program. And a key component of that transition plan is that they outline the post-secondary goals related to training, education, and employment. And so I'm really excited today to talk about how states and LEAs have been embedding CTE in an effort to do this. And I cannot move the slides. And so as part of that transition plan is outlines the transition services. And the transition services are critical because they're what help facilitate the student's movement from the school to the post-school activities. And some of those post-school activities are what you might think, which is post-school, like university and college, or full-time and part-time employment. But this could also be transitioning to vocational education and integrated employment. And part of that transition services, there might be individualized services, such as community experiences, and the development of employment skills that really help them be successful post-school. Another big piece of the transition services is the plan of study, or the coursework that the student takes. And this is where we typically see CTE is embedded. In some cases, this might be a single course, or in other cases, it might be a series of courses. And on the next slide, you'll see that the National Technical Assistance Center for Transition has been charged with outlining what are the practices and predictors that can be embedded within a transition services or transition plan that are likely to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. And as you'll see on this chart, and we'll share the link to it in the chat box, is that we look at predictors in terms of their impact on education, employment, and independent living. And if you look at employment, everything that you see listed has some impact, but those that have the black star are really those that have the largest impact. And if we click, what you'll end up seeing is that the occupational courses is a strong predictor of post-school employment for students with disabilities. And the way that this is defined under this work is a single course. So it's not a series of courses, but a single course. On the next slide, you'll see that there are a number of other predictors, and you'll see that vocational education, if we can click that, is also a strong predictor. And this vocation education is more what we see for students who participate in a concentration of CTE courses or employment-based courses. So we do know from the research that a single course as well as a concentration course leads to better outcomes. Now, if we look at a review of the findings of research, I want to point out 4 main things. The biggest thing is that most of the research that we have now with CTE and students with disabilities has focused primarily on students with mild disabilities. In particular, it focuses on students with learning and mild intellectual disabilities. And that research has really shown a positive impact for students, and I'll share some of those outcomes. There's also some research, although limited, that looks at the benefits of CTE for students with emotional disturbance or behavior disorders, as it might be known. And we've seen those effects up to 2 years post-school. And although there's a disproportionate representation of students with learning disabilities in the CTE research, there are some small studies that have been looking at its impact on students with severe disabilities. What's interesting is the results of these studies tend to be mixed. And some of the reasons might be the disconnect between what's happening in the K-12 setting and what happens post-school. So they're not getting the services as they leave school, so they're not able to sustain the benefits they received from CTE. The second finding really gets at this idea of school completion. I think we look at CTE and we say, oh, we're thinking about employment outcomes. But there are a lot of other benefits that have been found in the research for students with disabilities. In a study in Massachusetts, they found that 70% of students were 70% more likely to graduate in a 4-year cohort than students who did not participate in CTE. In addition, in Oregon, they found that students who participated in CTE as part of the school program had significantly better outcomes on 4-year high school completion than the state average. And while graduation is important, we're also really concerned about dropout for students with disabilities, and there's some initial research that indicates that we can reduce dropout. The third finding really gets at the benefits of participation in CTE. And as I mentioned earlier, there are 2 ways to look at this, a single course versus a concentration. The majority of effects that we see really have to do with CTE concentration. So we're increasing employment opportunities when students have this access, and in fact, 2 times more likely to be employed full-time once they leave school. Some other effects that are great are this increased community participation, and this has to do with students who are individuals who are out in the employment world often make relationships that lead to other social opportunities. And I think the last bullet is really important, is that although we focused a lot on this employment, CTE has a really strong effect on improving students' access to post-secondary education. And we see this even when students are taking remedial courses. In the fourth finding, I think this really highlights this need for a CTE concentration, because while there are some positive effects for individual courses, we really see strong effects when students are able to participate in a minimum of 3 credits of CTE that really build on a particular skill. And we've seen this with students with learning disabilities, emotional disturbance, and intellectual disabilities. And before I pass this over to my colleague, I just want to highlight a couple of challenges that states and local education agencies might be finding in terms of using CTE. That's on my next slide. And then these 4 are really what have set up the purpose of this series. There are 4 different webinars, and in those webinars, we'll be talking about some of the challenges and sharing some of the innovative strategies that local education agencies, as well as states, have taken to address these challenges. The first big challenge is that students with disabilities, in some cases, don't really meet the program requirements to participate in CTE. And as a result, we see less access, or we see access that's limited only to certain types of CTE programs. And some of that is a single course versus a series or a certificate course. We also see that sometimes CTE programs don't really have the access to the supports necessary to help students with disabilities be successful. And this may be in part due to teacher training. So CTE teachers don't really know how to support students. And as a result, they're not prepared. And we'll be talking about this in our 4th webinar. And then the last one is really the lack of collaboration within and across state agencies. And sometimes what we see is that we might have an LEA connection with an SEA, but the SEA is not connecting with other agencies or vice versa. And we'll be highlighting some of the strategies that states and local education agencies have taken in our next 2 webinars. I'm going to pass this over to my colleague, Dr. Theobald, who's going to share some of his recent research on looking at CTE in particular, or in relation to these post-secondary outcomes as well.
All right, thanks so much, Tessie. My name is Roddy Theobald. I'm at the National Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research at AIR. I'm really excited to be talking about this research that's very closely related to the topic of this webinar. It's research that was done with my colleagues Dan Goldhaber, Trevor Gratz, and Chris Holden, who are at AIR and the University of Washington. This research is funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, the U.S. Department of Education, and also relies on data provided by the Education Research and Data Center in Washington State. And it's that data that really distinguishes this research from some of the research that Tessie was talking about before, in that while a lot of prior research on CTE for students with disabilities has relied on smaller case studies or nationally representative data, we're using data on every single student in K-12 public schools in the state of Washington. And that's important for a couple of reasons. First, it gives a statewide picture of the relationships between CTE participation and longer-term outcomes. And Washington's a particularly good place to do this research because it maintains very detailed data about students in the state and has linked their K-12 data sets to post-secondary outcomes, including employment and post-secondary attendance in the state's public universities. So for this specific research, we're tracking 2 cohorts of 10th grade students with disabilities from 10th grade through the first year after their expected graduation date. And just to give you a sense of the data, this is way too much information, but just to give a couple important pieces of background. The first, and this is related to a question that I saw in the chat box about how we're defining disabilities. These are disabilities for which students are receiving special education services, and we have this information in the data. And for the purposes of this study, we're gonna consider students receiving special education services for all of these disability types, but control for this within our models. In other words, students with disabilities are only going to be compared to other students with disabilities who are receiving special education services for the same disability. Overall, across these 2 cohorts of students, there are a little over 16,000 students with disabilities in the sample, which is a lot of data and lets us really delve into some of the nuances in relating CTE participation to longer-term outcomes. So I'm going to give you a little information about the broader study and then just focus on some of the findings that are most relevant to this webinar. In the overall study, we consider a number of outcomes as we track these students from 10th grade through their post-secondary outcomes. We consider absences in high school. We consider their test scores in 10th grade when students are tested in Washington. We consider their persistence to 11th grade and 12th grade, their graduation at the end of 12th grade, and then college attendance and employment after graduation. In the paper, we also consider 2 different what are called malleable factors. This is terminology used by the Department of Education to refer to factors that can be changed to improve outcomes for students. In the paper, we focus on CTE participation and inclusion in general education classes. For the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to focus on a subset of the findings that make two restrictions. First, I'm only going to focus on what Tessie referred to as students who take a concentration of CTE courses. Following some prior research in this area, we're defining that as students with disabilities who take 4 or more credits of CTE during high school. We're going to look at students with disabilities who take a concentration of CTE courses relative to students with disabilities who don't, and look at 4 outcomes: their absences in 12th grade, whether or not they graduate at the end of 12th grade, whether or not they attend college the next year, and whether or not they are employed the following year. And to do that, instead of making raw comparisons between those groups, we're going to make those comparisons within a model that tries to control for differences between students with disabilities who take a concentration of CTE courses and students with disabilities who don't. There are good reasons to believe that's not a fair apples-to-apples comparison. So all the results I'm going to show you in the next few slides are controlling for a number of factors that could be predictive of these outcomes. For example, we're controlling for students' 8th grade test scores, the disability for which they're receiving special education services, their history of special education participation and absences from school, other demographic information such as race and poverty level, peer effects, in other words, students with whom they take other classes at school, and then finally, we're only going to make comparisons within the same school district. So the way to think about the results I'm going to show is that if you take 2 students with disabilities who look the same on all of these measures, in other words, who have similar test score histories, who are receiving special education for the same disability type, who have similar prior special ed histories and demographics, who attend the same district, these are how our models predict outcomes will differ for students who take a concentration of CTE courses relative to students with disabilities who don't. So moving on to a summary of the results, let's first focus on the results for absences. This figure, the right bar shows predicted absences for students with disabilities who take a concentration of CTE courses in high school in Washington State relative to students with disabilities who don't. The y-axis, the scale is a little hard to understand. This is standardized so that the average number of absences in the state is set to 0. So overall, students with disabilities tend to have more absences than the average student, but students with disabilities who take a concentration of CTE courses tend to have fewer absences in 12th grade than students with disabilities who do not. And again, that's controlling for all of the variables I discussed on the previous slide. Next, looking at graduation, the y-axis is referring to the proportion of students with disabilities who were still on track to graduate as they entered 12th grade, who do graduate on time at the end of the grade. We did this a number of different ways, but that's what I'm going to show here. Overall, students with disabilities who take a concentration of CTE courses are more likely to graduate on time at the end of 12th grade than students with disabilities who do not. The third outcome is college attendance, and this is the one variable where we do not see a significant difference between the 2 groups, and I think this is potentially important given a focus on college readiness and the reauthorization of IDEA. But again, the conclusion here is we do not see a strong relationship between CTE participation and college enrollment. However, when we look at employment, students with disabilities who participate in a concentration of CTE courses are more likely to be employed after graduation than similar students with disabilities who do not. So to wrap up this brief summary of the paper, we find that, again, controlling for observable differences between these groups, students with disabilities who enroll in a concentration of CTE courses in high school tend to have fewer absences, are more likely to graduate on time, and are more likely to be employed after graduation. It's important to add the caveat that it's not necessarily the case that participation in CTE courses is what causes these outcomes. We don't have a randomized control trial, so we can't conclude definitively that these are causal relationships. However, I do think that the study provides suggestive evidence that CTE participation has benefits for students with disabilities. We're very fortunate to have representatives from Washington State who can give a little bit more context about why we might be seeing these results in the data. Feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions about this research. The paper is available on Calder's website, but I think the next step in the webinar is to hand it back to Jamar for questions.
Great, thank you both, Dr. Bailey and Dr. Theobald. And we will be sure that those resources are available after the webinar. But we do have a question, and I'm wondering if you could, either of you could respond to it in relation to the research. And then we'll also ask our Washington presenters as well what their experiences have been. So the question is around mindset, and in the participants' question, in their particular region, they're struggling with CTE teachers who believe that their programs are meant only for those who are entering the technical industry, and it has to be attached to their courses. So in this sense, students with disabilities might only be placed into or viewed for entry-level skills, as opposed to having a higher set of expectations about their employability. So do you have any, in reflection of the research, any thoughts about that type of scenario and how we might change that mindset?
So this is Tessie, and I'll just first respond to that. This is actually a very common issue, and it's why it shows up in the 4th webinar of this series. The mindset, and I would say it's not just limited to CTE, because we also see a need for a mindset shift within special ed, is that students with disabilities can access CTE courses. And part of this, and we'll see some examples in our next 2 webinars, and I think Washington will also talk about this, is that we need to engage our stakeholders around this particular issue. I don't know that it's intentional. I think it's just an understanding based on previous experiences. In working with one of the states that I work with through the NCSI, they have had some challenges because the way CTE is set up is a CTE teacher gets dinged if students don't meet all the requirements. So there's a reluctance to allow students with disabilities who may not be able to address each of those requirements. And by looking at how we can change state policy or even local policy, we can engage students better, and then I think alleviate some of the challenges that CTE folks may see. And in this particular state, what they were sharing with CTE teachers, or allowing them to do, is give credit for the skills the student was able to master, and they would get credit for that, versus being dinged for the skills the kid was unable to master.
And this is Roddy. I can't speak to this question directly, but I think it makes for a really excellent segue to our next presenters, if we want to do that. In that, the one thing I can speak to from the data in Washington is that as a state, in terms of what courses count towards the state's requirements for CTE participation, the state tends to take quite a broad view of what kind of qualifies as a CTE course. And I think that's related to the part of the question about whether this is, kind of what the purpose of CTE is. And I'm sure that's something that both Tanya and Becky are going to be able to speak to quite knowledgeably in the next part of the webinar.
And it also relates to another question that we've received about the credit, right? So in terms of, what's the credit amount or allocation in relation to a full year of coursework? So for example, is it 1 credit to 1 full year of coursework? Is it more? How is that set up? And so I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca Wallace and Tanya May, and then we can come back to some of these other questions that could be informed by all of your perspectives, both the research perspective and then the policy and practice perspective. So Rebecca and Tanya, I turn it over to you.
Well, excellent. Can everybody hear us okay?
Yes.
Or can even one, as long as one person can, we are good to go. Thank you for indulging us in that test. My name is Becky Wallace. I do get the opportunity to serve our state as the Executive Director of CTE. Very happy to be with you this afternoon.
And good afternoon. My name is Tanya May, and I'm the OSPI Director of Special Education. So thank you very much for allowing us this opportunity to speak with you about how we're supporting students in our state.
And we are advancing the screen now, or hopefully the screen will advance fairly quickly. The next slide you're going to see is what our state uses as our career and technical education model. And I think this is really important and gets to some of the question around mindset and approach, because this is for our model for all students. And so when you look at the outcomes that are expected of CTE, we really drive home that the academic proficiency and growth for all students through career and tech ed experiences is critically important, as is the connection for all students to understand the different pathways that exist to enter into the world of work and to post-secondary experiences. So our theory and classroom instruction component is aligned to academic learning standards, industry standards, and our 21st century leadership skills. So those are those soft skills or employability skills that we hear from employers are absolutely critical for students to demonstrate. And we think it's pretty important for them to have a safe place in the K-12 system to practice some of those skills prior to being held to those standards. So after they take what they learn in the classroom in a theoretical standpoint, we have them apply it in practice through hands-on approach. The extended learning component are the learning activities that make those connections more real. They happen outside of the scheduled school day and school year under the supervision of an instructor. And then really that middle part is critical. Our career and technical student organizations are the piece where we can put all of that practice into action, either through leadership or skill development, community service and service-based learning, and making those just more identified connections as they expand. I think one of the real, it's not on the slide, but I think a big piece that's important in mindset is that the difficulty in looking at data nationwide is that a lot of the CTE programs administered at the state level are going to have just little tiny nuances that are different in our state plans with the feds related to Perkins administration. So in our state, while we do look at industry certificate attainment for students as an indicator, the teachers are not held there's no negative connotation related to it. So we have looked at achievement and celebrating success in different ways. We've looked at different performance outcomes for our CTE programs, which we feel are probably help us demonstrate that our programs outcomes are not just to have students ready to enter the world of work. That's short-sighted in our mind, and so that approach may be why we have a little bit different data or experience in our state.
And I wanted to just speak a little bit on the next couple of slides around our new work and building our Every Student Succeeds Act plan, the priorities for that, and then the priorities for our own work in implementing the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So in terms of ESSA, we're looking at pursuing equity, closing those opportunity gaps. One approach has really been to make sure that this improvement cycle is for all schools. We included in our plan a calculation for every building, not just the basic requirement of including our Title I schools. So we really do mean everyone. Our number of buildings identified for support has increased from about 200 in this new plan to close to 900. So just taking a little bit of a step back and thinking about the purpose of IDEA in serving our students with disabilities. So we're looking at IEPs and the standards that we are helping students to reach toward a diploma or certificate of completion, and helping every student be ready for their further education, employment, and independent living. And there's a real alignment there in these purposes. So IDEA, we're talking about the provision of special education services to ensure access and progress for our students. And that does align with ESSA's purpose of closing those achievement gaps and offering significant opportunities for a high quality education. So we thought, as part of this conversation, that it would be important to dig into a little bit of our state plan and how some of that is helping us focus on this work. So these are the indicators that we have included in our Washington School Improvement Framework. And so for secondary level, we're looking at proficiency in English language arts and math, English learner progress, graduation, and then what are the school quality student success indicators? So attendance, 9th grade on track, and then what we're going to focus on today, which is the dual credit advanced course taking.
So in relation to what we've defined as dual credit options that our schools are reporting on and explaining as opportunities for our students, we have courses that really involve an exam at the end of the experience. So advanced placement, international baccalaureate, and Cambridge International would be those options. And then we have a lot of course developed options. College in the high school is one, running start, and then what used to be known as tech prep federally is known in our state as CTE dual credit course options as well. And these all require articulation or agreements, very specific program standards and outcomes, and reporting mechanisms from our schools to our state.
So this is a snapshot of the data for one of our high schools. When our buildings or district partners log on, this is what it would look like for them. And it's pretty representative of our statewide data. So of the schools identified for comprehensive and targeted supports under our ESSA plan, we see a pattern that students with disabilities and our English learners represent the largest percentages of students experiencing those opportunity gaps. So while this particular building, the percentages aren't as low as what we might see in other areas, it still does show that opportunity gap. And then here's a little bit building on some of the data that we looked at a little bit earlier. So this is a comparison of, in blue, the percentage of our students with disabilities concentrated really in grades 7 through 12, and how they break down according to eligibility category. And then the comparison there, the orange bar, is the same spread of our students with disabilities who are accessing CTE courses. And so this one goes through some of the similar data, but just a little bit deeper in terms of grade level. So here we're looking at, by each grade level, what percentage are all students representing, compared with our students with disabilities, how they're represented in each grade level. And then the final bar is the concentration of students with disabilities, again, accessing CTE courses. So you can see there's that higher concentration at the high school level, which we would expect. And so, you know, in the special education field, disproportionality is a concept that we look at very deeply. And so it's a measure of any potential over or even under identification, and in this case, looking at by race and ethnicity. So the first column is the representation of our students with disabilities in Washington by their concentration of race and ethnicity. So that's just all special education. And then the second column shows a similar breakdown by race and ethnicity, but showing participation in CTE. And similar to what we saw with the individual eligibility categories, what's notable about this graph is that really the lack of a significant difference. So that's something that's positive. And so as we have been implementing our ESSA plan and really supporting schools into digging into some of this data, which for some of them, it's a new way to think about these outcomes. These are our priorities in our special education division. So we're coalescing around leadership to support students and really being cross-divisional around that work, having a growth mindset, increasing expectations for our students with disabilities, which includes instruction, graduation, the advanced coursework, attendance, etc. Implementing evidence-based practices in a multi-tier system of support, cross-divisional professional development and resource allocation, and then recruitment and retention of teachers. So Becky's going to take us a little bit deeper into some of the priorities for career and technical education.
So in our state, when we look at the administration of our Perkins funding, which is just one element of the funding that goes to support career and tech ed in our state, Washington may be unique in some ways to other states in that we do have a CTE enhancement driver, but it is not based on whether a course is exploratory or preparatory. And some other states do designate funding in a different way. And so when we look at our state investments and our federal investments, we try to align some of our monitoring components through consolidated program review. And a big key piece that we're doing when we're either monitoring through an online upload process or whether we're actually on site is really specific evidence through looking at enrollment reports. We're looking at the documents that are used. We're looking at IEPs and 504s and ensuring that CTE educators are part of developing those plans. And we're looking at the district is very clearly using barrier reduction strategies to increase enrollment of all students for special populations. If we had courses in which we saw zero enrollment, we would have that as a finding, and we would want to dig in with that district and understand what was happening. And I think that's really, really critically important. The other piece that we're looking for is intentional service and support plans to make sure that we are best serving the needs of our students and that the opportunities, doors of opportunities are open through CTE and the extended opportunities that are offered as well. And then community and education partnerships must have representatives of special populations. So our advisory committees must have community engagement specialists. For example, our workforce board, when we're developing state plans, the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation is heavily involved. And so I think we really try to, as much as possible at the state level, model a systemic approach as well as at the local. We expect that there is a high level of engagement as they're drafting their local plans for implementation, which would also include identifying some gaps and needs in teacher development. So I really appreciate the earlier speaker's nod to making sure that our support mechanisms include that the instructors that are leading these course experiences have the support that they need to do their best work for all their students. We also monitor for risk and focus our funding and technical support. An example of that would be this year we are funding through Perkins Reserve projects some school districts to develop Go Baby Go teams, which the Go Baby Go implementation would be basically, it's a community-based research design outreach program that's focused on mobility and socialization for children with limited motor function. And so we would be having, we're excited to see kind of the impact of these pilots and as well as the impact to our students that are involved in these projects. That would be one example of how we're focusing some funding in that way. And then career and technical student organizations, the extended learning and work-based learning. We certainly have the supported instruction. We're lucky enough to have a teacher from Yakima. Kathy Thomas sent us some examples of her students that our students that are part of this special population but are engaging through the career and tech student organizations, both skill development competitions as well as leadership development. And then our CTSOs also understand and have policies related to modifications where needed and necessary. So we feel like the opportunity to connect students to career paths and make it clear, that is important for all of our students, but it's also equally important that we're advancing their academic proficiency and growth, that there is an investment where students feel like they are important, that they have a place and have some controlled success. And we think that that works very well through our CTE delivery. I'm sorry.
So on this slide, we thought that this might be a good time to dive a little bit into our district showcase as we think about these priorities. And so I wanted to talk with you a little bit about Quincy School District. So Quincy is a large rural school district. It's just under 3,000 total students and about 400 students with disabilities in their district. There are 88% Hispanic and Latino, and about 83% free and reduced lunch. So it's a region that has a lot of need. And in terms of some of their special education data, so their grad rate is a little bit below the state average. Their grad rate's about 60.9% for students with disabilities. And in terms of their post-school outcomes, their 3-year average of looking at 1 year after students with disabilities leave school, what the engagement rate is. Are they competitively employed? Are they in higher education? Are they doing some sort of other employment or education? And that rate is an average of about 61%, which also is below the state average of 72. And so I share that because I just wanted to highlight that, again, this isn't a region that just experiences a level of need that is higher than some other communities. Their unemployment rate just for the entire population is what we would say is moderate, a little bit higher than average. They're at 7.8%. And yet, when we look at the indicators that feed into our ESSA plan for the dual credit, their dual credit completion indicators about 33% overall for their student population. And that holds steady for their Hispanic and Latino population, as well as their students with disabilities. Those are at over 30%. So we're not seeing that opportunity gap in this community the way that we are in many of our other communities. And I was able to do a site visit this school year and talk with them. And it was just amazing to me to see the collaborative relationship between the high school administration, the special education director, and their CTE director. In terms of the priorities that they shared, they really do approach their CTE work as access for all. They make sure that they find a way to include all students who would like to participate. They have joint professional development and cross-divisional professional development for their CTE staff, and they also make sure to include their paraeducators. And they really have a focus on those extended learning opportunities that Becky talked about. So Becky and I wanted to just kind of close with talking about some of the next steps that we're thinking of. One of the newer developments for our agency, we're working on our strategic plan, and in looking at that, we're identifying 5 drivers to focus on, looking at dual language, core instruction, whole child and family and community, multiple pathways, and extended learning. And then our agency is also working with some national TA centers on developing a braided funding document. And I just wanted to call that out because there was an intentional effort to make sure that these advanced coursework options are included in those vignettes so that people can see some very practical ways to advance this work and be innovative around funding. We've also developed a guidance document to assist IEP teams and school counselors with just identifying considerations for developing high school and beyond plans that are in line with secondary transition plans. And then finally, just to wrap up from the special education perspective, we're also working with our Student Information Office and the Center for Change and Transition Services to include additional data points such as participation in CTE courses and EL status in our post-school outcome data. Anything to add there? Okay.
Excellent.
We're trying to advance. Thank you. Sorry, we were waiting on the slide.
No problem.
So we flashed our names and then they disappeared. Thank you.
No, Becky and Tanya, thank you both. Just some excellent information, and we have had a number of questions come through. So I'm going to synthesize some of them. Some of them overlap, but one is more of a practice question, and just being sure that there's clarification. In your admission path, is it open enrollment, or is there, in quotes, a slot system in place in Washington?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's part of what we've heard back from school districts is when they try to show evidence to make sure they've removed barriers, there's a lot of frustration because our school districts have open enrollment. So they don't have a prohibited, I guess, structure. The courses are offered, they forecast, and there's not a specific slot system in place that I know of. I'd have to dig in and find out from some school districts if there was some other type of system being used. But most all do open enrollment.
Okay, great. And then this is also more of it was a statement, but also it's a question that we hear a lot. And so I think it would be great if you all would be able to reflect on it. And also I open it up to our earlier presenters as well. But one of the comments was in relation to something that you said about young adults and when they actually start training. And so given some of the barriers, some of our students with disabilities don't even get the option to start in programs that are CTE-like or CTE until after high school. And the thought about how that is, that's doing a disservice, because in that sense, you can't serve the young person effectively at the right time in their transition, and that the workforce could actually have a greater, more positive impact if access was allowed earlier. Do you have any thoughts or observations or experiences that you can offer to folks about how Washington has been able to maximize or strives to maximize the opportunities for students with disabilities as early on in the process as possible?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think even federally, when you look at some of the proposed changes around Perkins lowering CTE potentially to the 5th grade level, I think that we may see some trends that way. We have limited options in middle school, and if you look at the enrollment that Tanya shared, you'll see that we see earlier touch points. Certainly, we know that is still not capturing all, and so it is a good point about when the touch point starts. I think, you know, we have some of our policies related to equivalency credit, that because a student can get their academic graduation credits met through current technical education, both through local equivalency and state equivalency, I believe that has an impact on students being able to enter that experience maybe earlier in their careers in some cases. But I appreciate that you started that with that. It may require some reflection. I think it does. I think it is a good question to ask, or what are the ways that we have kind of lowered barriers, because we typically get to look at data and we get pleasantly surprised, and then we get very focused on any school districts that don't seem to follow those same trends to dig in. And I think with our work with ESSA, we're going to continue to have more of those opportunities, and maybe 6 months from now I'd have a very different response to the question.
Yeah, and I mean, what we hear from school districts is just an openness to finding a way for them. I mean, that, I think, when I think through the districts where they've shown us that they've had success with this, it's about meeting the students where they are when they can, and really being as supportive of both the staff and the students around providing access and accommodations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And we have a couple of more questions. So I'm going to ask another question that is more practice focused, and then we'll have a question that relates more to legislation, and actually will tie in nicely to the next section of the webinar. But the practice focus question was if you could share one or two specific anecdotes of special education students who are in special education who have thrived in CTE and what interventions were successful. So even if there are interventions that you know that have been successful and relate to students, I would say students across the disability spectrum, but who are involved in CTE, that would be great.
I do have one that comes to mind, and it might not immediately sound like it's connected to CTE, but that was the origin. So in Quincy, actually, they had a student who was hearing impaired, and she worked really closely with the interpreter and was able to complete courses. You know, still participated in the CTE program. And she now has returned to that district. She works at the high school now as an interpreter. She's just really connected to that community. And so that is just one that comes to mind from this district showcase.
And I had the privilege of my career starting in a school where I had the only fully integrated course. So my 9th grade students, some of our students with disabilities only exited their classroom to come to my class. So I have probably hours and hours of anecdotal key pieces that worked. I think that the things that come to mind, I certainly want to share Kathy Thomas's anecdotes. She didn't really drill down, the specifics related to IEP or 504, but I think it's important to know that the team that just won Skills USA in American Spirit and Community Action Project, 2 of the 3 team members were students that were on 504s or IEPs. And I think she has a multitude of examples, and so I would love to follow up with her to find out if she could give us some more drilled down information. I had a student who had short-term memory loss complications from open heart surgery as a young child, and so he really wanted to be involved with FFA, was the CTSO that was attached to the natural resources course that I taught. And so as part of those CTSO opportunities, they often have a knowledge component or they have a public speaking component, and oftentimes may rely on rote memorization of speaking pieces. And so the critical things that we did, obviously working in a team, the teammates got to assess the skills of their teammates. And for the individual with the short-term memory loss, we used trigger words and visuals so that he was able to just seamlessly share his required parts of what happened to be a community service project that they implemented. We specifically were looking at apple production, and he was able to draw into the things that he knew and be an expert on. And I think just creating that successful experience kept that student engaged for the next 4 years in a way that his parents expressed to be incredibly important to them. So we certainly could do some follow-up with the folks that are on this list as far as a kind of a tie to what modifications may have been made or what the specifics were of situations, but we would look forward to share those. Those are wins. Those are the things that we love to share. So that would be great if we could follow up with someone if there's interest.
Excellent. And I think go ahead, Tessie. Mm-hmm.
Well, I was just also, was going to orient folks to the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, because they have compiled a list of evidence-based practices that can be embedded within CTE courses to help with the facilitation of the learning. And as with the chart that I showed earlier, there are a number of things that have been found to be successful when it aligns. It's looking at the embedding of social skills, instruction on self-advocacy and self-determination, as well as goal setting. And those have high effect sizes.
Excellent. Excellent resource. And we had one other question, which will actually lead into the next part of the webinar. And we did have more questions coming in. And so at the end of the webinar, we have more time allotted for Q&A. So the one of the other questions that came in directly related to legislation, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And one of the things, Tanya and Rebecca, that we heard you all say is Perkins as one of the drivers. It's been a CTE enhancement driver, particularly around aligning and monitoring and consolidating some of your programming. And the question had been asked in light of legislation of WIOA and Employment First, how is it even possible CTE is not fully including students with disabilities? And I think that part of that is because not everybody is familiar with everybody else's law. So whether it's IDEA or ESSA or WIOA or Perkins, and how those things can look. Even Washington, you mentioned how you're working on a braiding funding document, and I think that's a great example of how every potential stakeholder could be involved in a common understanding and how they can implement each piece of policy to support students with disabilities, and in this case, with funding being, one of the drivers, and how to work together in alignment. So I will give the group an opportunity to reflect on that after our next presentation, which will be Jenna Tomasello talking with us about how SNIDEA can support college and career readiness for students with disabilities. So Jenna, I turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Jamar, and hello everyone. Again, my name is Jenna Tomasello. I'm a policy associate at the American Youth Policy Forum. So today I'm going to talk about the new CCR Center brief, how ESSA and IDEA can support college and career readiness for students with disabilities. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So this brief examines how the two federal laws, ESSA and IDEA, can promote meaningful pathways to post-secondary opportunities for students with disabilities. And so just to give a rundown of everything the brief covers, it examines data on secondary and post-secondary education and employment outcomes, considers how college and career readiness strategies can support pathways to post-secondary education and careers, provides analyses of the provisions under ESSA and IDEA that support college and career readiness, features examples of effective practices, includes guidance for state leaders. And so for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to focus mainly on the provisions under ESSA and IDEA that support college and career readiness for students with disabilities. But before I get into that, I do just want to make a note based on the last question that was given. And so while the focus of this brief is on ESSA and IDEA, there are other federal laws out there to help students with disabilities that I just want to mention. So of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act that Rebecca and Tanya in Washington mentioned, WIOA that was just mentioned in the last question, and also the Rehabilitation Act. And so all of these laws impact students with disabilities in different ways and can be coordinated to support smoother transitions to post-secondary education and work, which the third webinar in this series, Maximizing Post-Secondary Outcomes for Students with Disabilities Through Systems Alignment, will discuss in more depth. So I'm not going to spend too much time on either of the key federal legislation slides because I think that Dr. Bailey and also Tanya and Rebecca in Washington State gave a great overview, but I do just want to highlight that ESSA grants states significant flexibility over the designs of their accountability systems and encourages the use of more college and career readiness measures of student success. As we heard, Washington State sounds like they're really taking advantage of. And also, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about IDEA, but I just do want to mention one other piece related to accountability. And so in 2014, the Results-Driven Accountability Initiative by the U.S. Department of Education Office for Special Education Programs revised IDEA's accountability system to ensure states are complying with IDEA, resulting in improvements in educational outcomes in students with disabilities. And so I'll spend more time a little bit later talking about that. But really, the idea is that the State Systemic Improvement Plan under Results-Driven Accountability and the accountability plans under ESSA should really align to the maximum extent possible to ensure we're ensuring students with disabilities are meeting their college and career readiness goals. And so just to note a few of the strategies mentioned in the brief for supporting college and career readiness for students with disabilities who may face unique challenges. And so high expectations and access to the general curriculum, college and career advising and transition planning, career pathways, dual and concurrent enrollment, and personalized and competency-based learning. And I do just want to note that the additional webinars in the series will be touching on a number of these different strategies to better support students with disabilities and their career readiness. And so now let's talk about some of the opportunities for aligning ESSA and IDEA, including a number of opportunities that Rebecca and Tanya mentioned in their overview of what's going on in Washington State. And so first, states can address college and career readiness in their ESSA state plans under Title I, Part A in two major ways. One, they can include college and career readiness in the programmatic and use of funds sections of their plans, which could entail using college and career readiness strategies, such as career pathways as a school improvement or turnaround strategy, or using college and career readiness as a student support through college and career exploration, advising, and mentoring. And two, states can also address college and career readiness in their accountability plans by including items like earning industry certifications, measuring participation in dual and concurrent enrollment or AP courses, or looking at post-graduation outcomes such as post-secondary degree attainment and employment. State plans for ESSA and the state systemic improvement plans for results-driven accountability, like I mentioned, should align to the maximum extent possible so that programs under each law are working together to support college and career readiness for students with disabilities. Second, Title IV of ESSA can be particularly helpful in supporting college and career readiness, as it includes career and technical education, college and career counseling, and dual and concurrent enrollment as allowable strategies to promote a well-rounded education. IDEA provides educational services to eligible students beyond age 18, and ESSA allows supports of dual enrollment classes. So for example, it is possible that older students with disabilities who are still enrolled in high school could take dual enrollment classes at a post-secondary institution, allowing them to engage with their peers and earn college credit before leaving the more supportive K-12 system. Third, Title II of ESSA supports professional development and allows states to develop strategies for integrating academic and career and technical education content and applied work-based learning into instruction. For example, teachers of academic subjects, career and technical education, and special education can participate in joint professional development, promoting the sharing of strategies that are particularly effective for helping students with disabilities prepare for college and careers. And so the fourth webinar in this series, Teacher Preparation for Inclusion of Students with Disabilities, will focus specifically on this issue of teacher prep. And finally, an important provision under IDEA related to college and career readiness is the requirement to develop a transition plan for students by the time the student turns 16 or before to help them move from secondary to post-secondary activities. And Dr. Bailey did a great job of highlighting this earlier in the presentation. And so transition planning under IDEA and college and career ready planning in ESSA should be aligned to help students with disabilities successfully move from high school to post-secondary education and employment. And I just want to flag for everyone on the webinar that our next webinar on June 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time will focus on aligning transition planning at the state, district, and school levels. And I'm going to leave it there. There's my contact information, and also if you're interested in learning more and downloading the brief, it can be found on AYPF's website as well as the College and Career Readiness and Success Center's website. Thank you.
Great, Jenna, thank you. And we do have more questions that have come in, so we'll try to get to as many as possible before the end of our time, and questions that we aren't able to answer now, we will hopefully be able to follow up and answer them, and or the answers may be provided in one of the other remaining 3 webinars in our Pursuit of Equity series. So first, there was a question that said, is there, it would be beneficial, and is there a comparison chart between IDEA, WIOA, Perkins, ESSA, et cetera? And so actually the CCR Center has 2 different tools, one which Jenna just referred to, which is ESSA and IDEA, and then we also have a brief, a workbook, and an interactive tool that highlights ESSA, Perkins, and WIOA. And so I just sent out that link to everyone. We strongly encourage you to take a look at that. One of the questions that came in, Jenna, during as you were highlighting your pieces is wondering how dual enrollment is actually working for others. So in this particular participant's case, they have a number of students who are credit deficient, so dual enrollment doesn't seem possible. And I'm wondering if any of our presenters have any reflection on that.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that maybe Washington or even Dr. Bailey can jump in with this, but I think offering the dual enrollment example really, we at AYPF, we see that as an opportunity, thinking about if ESSA is going to include a lot of call out for dual enrollment, and thinking about how the time for students with disabilities can be extended within the K-12 system, that there might be an opportunity there. But I'm wondering if others are able to speak to specific anecdotes about how that might be working.
Washington's here.
Yeah,
sorry.
No, please, yes.
We were hoping for some clarification by just specifically what's meant by the dual enrollment. Is it like Running Start, that kind of program?
I think what's meant by the dual enrollment is the opportunity for students to take college courses while still being in the K-12 system, or dual or concurrent enrollment. And so that might mean that students are taking courses at a post-secondary institution, or it could mean that they are able to participate in courses within their secondary school that is taught for college credit.
Great, thank you for clarifying. Sometimes we use similar terms and for different meanings. So when we look at credit deficiency, we have, I think I mentioned the equivalency credit, where a student can have a CTE course meet their mathematics or science or English. We do feel like that helps quite a bit with credit deficiency for some students. We also have a 2-for-1 policy in our state, which again is not dual enrollment, but I do think it gets to some opportunities that students have. The 2-for-1 policy means a student can complete a course and it can meet the graduation requirements in 2 areas. It's typically CTE and an additional area. That also may help some with our credit deficiency issues as well. I would suggest that the tech prep, formerly known as tech prep CTE dual credit opportunity, there's not a restriction related to if a student is credit deficient that would prohibit them from taking a course that has that opportunity. If you go on our Washington State report card, you can see our demographics are broke down by participants and concentrators related to achieving. It still says tech prep. And we know that we have over 11,000 students that are earning dual credit right now in the college system. Now they have to enter that college system to be able to take that portable credit with them currently, and the articulation agreements are between a school district and a community and technical college. And because it's not a statewide approach, I would say that's a barrier in our state. There is some restrictions related to that that I think we are still trying to put our heads together in Washington to figure out how to kind of eliminate some of those issues. But certainly AP opportunities and IB opportunities may be a little bit more difficult to wrap our minds around for deficiency, as well as even college in the high school. A lot of our programs are aligning with college in the high school programs that offer credit opportunity. And I don't know that we have been doing it long enough to look at any data to find out if are any trends that we could really speak to related to that.
And just to kind of wrap that up, just in terms of credit deficiency in general, whether it's related to CTE access or not, there's more and more availability of credit retrieval options. Districts really are thinking outside the box with offering options for students, whether it be on campus in a skills center or even at home.
Great. Excellent responses. And we are almost at time, but I do want to ask one more question that has come in, because we hear it frequently, both in the context of students with disabilities as it relates to CTE, and then also as it relates to students with disabilities and work-based learning. And the question is around how do you provide guidance to schools and districts to ensure that that there's full CTE access in every CTE area for students with intellectual or behavioral disabilities, particularly in the context and worry about liability, safety, or danger around equipment. That's a common question we hear in the field related to CTE and work-based learning. And so I'm hoping you may be able to offer some comments or thoughts on that.
And this is Tessie, and I just want to sort of respond to this at a higher level. If you have program requirements that are focused on skills, then a student is still required to meet the minimum skills in order to participate, just as if they were looking for a job. I think some of the challenges come from, a parent saying, I want my kid in that program. And the question is, can any kid get in that program, or are there requirements that must be met? I think we want to be careful about saying things like, students with emotional disturbance or students with this label aren't able to be accepted into the program, and instead focus on what are the skills necessary to be successful in the program. And in the IEP writing, just be sure that you, as part of your transition services, you may be exploring, are they eligible for those particular programs. 504 requires that students have access, but they must be otherwise qualified, right? So it's just not carte blanche. You can do whatever you want, just like for any kid. But we have to ensure that they have an opportunity to access those, and then are provided the appropriate accommodations if necessary to access those services. Just can't discriminate based on disability category.
Right. Excellent. Well, we are actually slightly over time at 4:17, but we want to thank all of our presenters for being able to join us today and talk about a very relevant and important topic, and also being able to highlight the research behind it. And we're really hoping that for you as participants, this can help you in your efforts. And we strongly encourage you to join us for the remaining webinars in this series, with our next one scheduled for June 28th from at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and that one will focus on transition planning. So once again, I want to thank you. Our information will be archived within 24 hours, along with resources that were mentioned during this webinar, and we hope to have your participation in the future part of this series. Thank you, everyone, for your participation.